So you wanted to talk about Three Little Pigs, something about ontologies, something about Neuralink, something about the terrifying reality that we're trying to reduce.
Oh, let's start with the obvious one. That was the weirdest recruitment session I have ever witnessed. I mean, it was pretty cool on one hand, but I mean, I like Elon. I think he's, Tony Starkish, but he just sucks at public speaking. Like, it is not a gift of his, which, hey, if I had his money, I could do whatever too. But like, I really thought, like when they sat down, they kind of went through each of what people do there, which was probably the more exciting part. I mean, there was a little bit of tech, there was a little bit of philosophy, which we'll get to in a moment. A little bit of animal husbandry, this is how we care.
In the true sense of the word. Yeah.
This is how we care for the pigs. I especially love that we don't let the pigs do unless they don't do anything they don't want to do. So they've kind of set up pig Montessori, you know what I mean? Like, it's
anybody has any pigs that they want to allow to explore their own?
I'm pretty sure there's a pig volition training course somewhere that's out there. Absolutely. They're like us, though. That was specifically mentioned.
I mean, empirically, you cannot prove that pigs don't have their philosophical constraints that they've defined for their own reality. So,
yeah, but remember, H. Douglas Adams always said that it was the dolphins that really. Okay, well, for those that get that, maybe I
like dolphins because I don't know if it's true or not, but I've always seen this floating around the web that dolphins mess with pufferfish because they get high.
Oh, yeah, there's like some coral. There's video of this.
So I feel like I identify with dolphins in that way.
Well, who needs pot when you got an implant in your head? I mean, that's the other side.
Oh boy, yeah.
So you actually sent me this text, and I'm going to remind you of this. Actually, I gotta find it. I won't quote you completely out of context, but I'm going to quote you completely out of context.
Is it the neckbeard one?
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of what some neckbeard deems you worthy of. That is a direct quote. We're not going to go down the neckbeard path at this point because us being bearded white dudes is probably getting close to the general.
I shaved the neckbeard a few days ago, so I'm like, I'm not qualified anymore.
Yeah, I got a little bit of the neck off here. I'm hearing. Here we go. I'm hearing, quote unquote, we can placate people and make them think their current status is okay. Which is, something about the sum of our collective will, right? So I thought this was interesting. So this goes to the whole point of ontology, right? The nature of being. We could go into the anthropological wellness and what society deems acceptable is not necessarily what a person do. We've been down this ethical rat hole before, or volitional rat hole. I mean, it's a rat hole, just whatever. So where did this come from, Ed? What are we truly looking at at the end of times here when it comes to having something implanted in my brain?
Quote
your favorite philosophers too while you're at it, because I'm not so smart as
you. I'm not going to quote anybody to start. I'm going to try to motivate this with the fact that we have our own, forget about external inconsistencies in our moral background, if you will, but internal, we have our own inconsistencies, sometimes on a minute by minute basis, and it's completely contextual. I know we were texting earlier today about this whole idea of context, but the reality is, like, it concerns me the ways in which this technology can shape who we are as internal individuals by accident, right? In ways that we aren't necessarily aware of, by exposing these kind of own internal inconsistencies that we have. Because what do you do with what Neuralink is, right? So it's measuring some sort of firing rate inside of your head, and it's trying to decompose this weird continuous representation of neurological firing patterns inside of your head into some digital representation that might capture some saliency with respect to what's going on, for some value of going on. It depends on how you want to measure that. It depends on what you're trying to measure, right? So when you start trying to understand what's going on with something like Neuralink, you head up back down the rat hole of like this internal consistency argument that like Descartes started, right, with this idea of duality versus, what kind of Leibniz embraced, which is like this materialist approach to what is it that makes us tick? Like, what is it that gives rise to this representation of consciousness, right? And this is kind of what everybody is after. And we're not going to get into the easy or the hard for some value of easy problem of consciousness, but that's ultimately what we're after with something like Neuralink. I mean, if you listen to the conversations that were going on with the individuals that were talking about what we might be able to do with the technology in the future, I don't have an exact number, but certainly a large enough count of people were referencing this idea of understanding consciousness that it made me curious. But I don't think we're going to be able to get down using something like Neuralink. I don't know if we're going to be able to do that. I don't know if it's measuring. We don't even know what it is that gives rise to consciousness yet, and we can't know what it is that we need to measure in order to determine what consciousness is. So, how does this bleed into will, right? Well, depending on how you want to view it and what lens you want to view this stuff from, or what angle you want to view this from, I mean, you could decompose that question to in a lot of different angles. Are we measuring potassium ions as they traverse synapses inside of the brain? Is that what gives rise to this representation that we call consciousness? I don't know. Is it the collective transfer of chemical signal inside of the brain that gives rise to consciousness? I don't know. And then what does that mean when we try to measure that and then create policy around it, right? So when you start talking about using what Neuralink can measure to do things like understand disease, cool, I'm all for it, but we need to understand that the policy that we potentially create around that can be impactful in a lot of different ways. So we need to understand if the representation that we're collecting from something like Neuralink is a good proxy, I guess, for the phenomena that we're trying to measure. Now, I get it. Neuralink was interesting. They have a bunch of different leads inside of pig brains right now that allow their snouts, when they sniff something, or when they kind of poke something with their snout, they can get a measurement out of this device. Cool. But what does that measurement mean? We don't know. We have no idea what that measurement means. It just knows we have a ground truth in that we know that the pig snout is poking something, but we don't really have anything other than that binary representation yet. So again, when we start talking about using these data sets to create these representations of reality that we can use to make decisions, it's just, from my perspective, kind of concerning. I don't want us to ignore the reality that we don't understand. Humans are really good at tricking ourselves into thinking we know more about the world and about the universe than we do. And I want to make sure that we have a collective measure in place to control for that. And really, the only collective measure I think that we have in place to control for that is something like science, right? Because built into this enterprise called science is a bunch of checks and balances that allow us to call bullshit on each other effectively. So
when we choose to use it, for sure.
And when we choose, yeah. Well, and the other challenge is too, any measurement of reality has a correspondence to the thing that you're measuring, right? So, and that correspondence ratio is a challenge in and of itself. How do we know that the apparatus that we're using to measure, it's the observer's phenomenon, right? How do we know that apparatus that we've created to measure that particular phenomenon has captured it sufficiently? And how do we account for potential noise in the channel, things along those lines, right? So again, when I look at these technologies, the scientist and the technologist and the engineer inside of me is in awe and excited about this technology. And then the human aspect of me is oh shit. We need to ramp up our humanities in, immeasurable ways with respect to the people who are building this technology, to help them understand that maybe we need to ask the core questions of, should we even do this, versus it's going to happen, right? I think a lot of people assume out of the gate that there's this technological imperative to everything, it's going to happen. There's some sort of destiny built into all of this. And I think maybe we should start questioning that. Maybe we should start questioning if there is this kind of destined approach to all of this. I've read things like policing companies who say that it's destiny that police are going to use these technologies and things along those lines. And when you use such a powerful word like destiny, it's concerning to me. So I'm going to stop ranting and let you discuss this as well. But in reality, when I see these again, we can get into the technical discussions around some of the challenges that are faced there, but I just, again, not understanding what it is that happens inside of our head, this is truly momentous. It'll allow us to try to understand it in a different way, and ultimately that's what we're trying to do as humans, is just try to understand this weird, reality, and then the rough approximations of reality that we can create. And then the other side of that, again, is the human side, which is like, oh shit, let's hope nobody tries to oppress an entire sect of people because of this, or using this, right?
Well, at least they didn't say they were going to try to. Well, at least they didn't say they were going to try to measure the soul, whatever that ends up being. You know what I mean? Like, no, and I'll echo a lot of those sentiments. I think I'm very, I'll use the pejorative, very right-brained, right? This is just, I'm not the engineer's engineer. It's just I'm okay with. I love hearing this stuff. If I can picture it, him holding up the little puck. I'll call it a puck, coin size thing with 1,024 leads on it at 5 microns thick. I mean, I can geek out about the stats on that, right?
Sure,
you're measuring amplitude, right? That's really what you're looking for. You're looking at those activations. I keyed in on, based on my background, I keyed in pigs have a low activation threshold. So they're absolutely happy to do things. Again, pig Montessori notwithstanding. They're absolutely happy to be a part of these things because they have such basic needs that they can be fulfilled very, very quickly, right? Positive reinforcement goes a long way. You make them happy, they're more compliant. You make them more compliant, they're more willing to do what you want them to do. To your points, maybe a little bit looser, if I'm able to, program, let's say, for lack of a better way of putting it, excess oxytocin in the brain, right? If I'm able to basically create these but think about it. If I have the keys to the kingdom, and if we look at the body, the human body as a rudimentary chemical soup and state, right? There are ways I can trigger the production of these things. We see this from psychiatry, right? I put medication in my body and I achieve an end. Now, getting to that formula.
I just real quick see halls full of people just hammering the dopamine button, but go ahead.
Better dopamine than morphine, I suppose. But all these things, not to make light of the situation, but that's a lot of these things, the latest fad in Silicon Valley was dopamine fasting, right? That was a thing. How do I prevent?
Yeah.
We come up with these hokey sciences. The last thing in the world you want to do is have Goop adopt, Neuralink as their token toy of the week, right? You too can smell like Gwyneth Paltrow's whatever. And, through the process of getting a puck implanted in your head. It's a real thing, by the way. But so you look at all this stuff, and I'm going around this, but the ability to create, or try to enforce order out of chaos. Like, we're organized chaos in our bodies, right? We have things that are firing. There's a level of order to it. We know that there's chemical reactions that lead to a result. Like you're saying, that's a measurement possibility, right? As a scientist, I can sit there and I can go, all right, I watched this chemical interaction. I know that there's an entry state, there's an exit state, and there's something that happens in the middle, right? Correlation. My nose touches something, I see a spike somewhere. I find out where that spike is. I can more narrowly refine my search for what causes and what affects it. So all these things together, like you're saying, the promise of this stuff from a purely mechanical or purely chemical basis is actually very, very cool. Elon mentioned at one point neural shunts. What if I could put a transmitter above a brake, spinal compression or whatever, and below it, and be able to jump that gap and suddenly restore movement to a paraplegic or a quadriplegic or tetraplegic, right? There's exciting promise and premise in that. Probably shouldn't recommend using Bluetooth as a way to connect to the device, given things that are out there. But all that to be said, there's some very rudimentary mechanical, electrical, and chemical things that we can do. I think the larger thing was some of those statements that were put out there, which is like, this makes me wonder about the nature of being. Yeah, dude, I don't necessarily want you thinking about the nature of my being. And if we enlarge that to a nation state, we can certainly choose countries or cultures that have chosen to look at mass organization or mass happiness indexes, social credit systems. I think you know which country I'm talking about. You always end up whispering it into the mic anyway, so.
China.
But that's the type of, while it's not on a person, or as a reward, a carrot and stick reward based on that, right? And so what you're doing is you're taking that and you're now centering it directly onto a person's physiology and neurobiology and those components and able to enact on it. I think that poses a danger. And so, yes, the human in me freaks out a little bit. It's excited about the promise, the premise. It's terrified at the abuse of it. It's terrified at the ultimate, some of the ultimate capabilities that it could bring. And there's, I think I gave a talk last year or this year. This year's gone so long, I don't even know what's going on anymore. Earlier this year, where it's just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? Sure. And so I think that fits kind of right in your model. So I agree with you completely. Like, at what point does it tip? Does it tip to the point where we shouldn't have done that? And are we going to be aware enough to catch it when it does happen? Or is it just that slippery slope that says, oh, now we're too far gone. Now we're turning into the Matrix here, buddy. Like the machines are taking over us. So
yeah, these are interesting things to think about. Again, we can appeal to history. This isn't the first time that we've created a technology that has questionable considerations generally. I mean, nuclear weaponry, obviously, being the most recent, at least in history. I'm sure we could trace us back a few times throughout many different human ages, if you will, to discover what type of weaponry we created that then fueled other areas of research.
Gunpowder?
Yeah.
Let's go back to fire, actually. I think
the person that looked up at these like balls of light in the sky that we created to celebrate things and was like, what if I put a piece of metal in front of that and pointed it at somebody else? I just wonder what goes through their mind. So yeah, it's tough. You referenced something with respect to like humans kind of being a function of input and output, right? And we don't necessarily care about, what that middle piece is, or at least that's what I took away from it.
Oh, I care very much what that middle piece is, but it's a lot harder. It's harder to solve for something that you can't quantify, right? The nature of being is something. Yeah, again, they wouldn't have come up with the term ontology, the nature of being, the study of being, without having, it's an ology, right?
So when you first said that, the thing that flashed into my head was like Mars levels of analysis, right? And it's this idea that you have like this higher level computational construct, and from there you have like an algorithmic implementation of it as you kind of walk down the stack. And you said like humans being a function, or something about functions having an input, something happens in the middle, having an output. The problem is a lot of the things that we're talking about, a lot of the things that we're trying to determine in this discussion aren't amenable to that framework yet. And when I say that, I mean, like, it depends on how you want to, and again, like I mentioned earlier in the conversation, the angle that you want to look at these things at or from. Some things are kind of like a functional approach to things. Like our perceptual systems are arguably some sort of functional approach to at least observing reality, right? Photons come into our eyes, hit our optical nerve, proceed through our visual complex, and all of a sudden, huzzah, we're presented with a bunch of information that allows us to reason about the world, right? Notwithstanding the fact that we drop, orders of magnitude of information on the floor because of compression. But I just want to make sure that, like, as we, again, explore these technologies, these are tough social issues. Like, there's so many, like, social, political, theological, even, like, viewpoints that you could apply to these different types of technology. And I think it's fantastic, again, from the technologist inside of me, that we're going to be able to learn yet another piece of information about the human brain. I just hope that, we understand and capture during this process, above and, like, first and foremost, the power transfer that happens with technologies like these. And what I mean by power transfer is, like, you'll see people in the world of, like, ethics and AI. So again, being somebody who works in the world of AI, generally this kind of resonates with me. Again, I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not a specialist that can embed leads inside of your head and then measure the synaptic pulses inside of your brain. But I do study this kind of stuff by proxy because of what it is that I study myself. So when I try to, like, reason through these things and try to understand, how is this going to impact our concept of self-determinism So you mentioned China earlier, right? You mentioned their social and political construct that they have in place that flies in the face of being an American. So I'm an American. It flies in the face of everything that I know, love, and understand, because our Constitution is built around this idea of self-determinism, or at least what people hope and is a rough approximation of self-determinism, with the kind of asterisk that we've created a legal system that we can go and change the laws to make sure that we can account for the fact that the world is non-stationary in general, right? And I'm just wondering, like, how do we as a collective global society at this point determine what the intersection of all of these different social, political, and cultural phenomenon are, and what is right, I guess, and for some value of right, and what is wrong, notwithstanding the fact that we're trying to reduce these spectrum conversations down to a digital representation. That's a whole nother can of worms that is a challenge in and of itself. But I mean, in reality, when we start to discuss what it is to take these higher level kind of constituent components of what creates a society and represent those things digitally, these questions start to crop up, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of efforts been made. Like you could go back to the UN, or at least the overall guidance of the UN, right? The idea that there could be us coming together as disparate countries, disparate rules, disparate cultures, right? Coming together and having plans together, right? Figuring out some of these major things. The role of the IMF to fund everybody and make everybody seem happy, right? We tend to stick our middle finger up in the air every single time anybody tries to tread on our national sovereignty, which, not here to turn this into a raging political debate, but probably not our brightest moment in the history of this, fledgling nation compared to some of these other ones. But that being said, we are constantly reshaping the surface of the earth when it comes to politics and society. I mean, look at the recent withdrawal of the UK from the EU. While it was a trade consortium, there was also other things at stake. There was that movement, idea, that exchange of information that was part and parcel of what was happening there. It doesn't mean it stops, but the freedom to express a lot of those things now has been curtailed. So you have some of these limiting factors that are enacted by governments that change and kind of alter the fabric of society. If I can no longer do X with a culture that I'm familiar with, if I no longer have access to this resource in a free and efficient manner, will I go out of my way to go find where I could find an alternative, or go out of my way to learn something new and do these things, right? So you kind of have this, constant reshaping. We're obviously, I was talking to somebody this morning about the idea of agitation, the idea that sometimes progress is required to have these social catalysts, these social agitation moments, because it's a forcing function. It moves us along, sometimes, or most of the time, unwillingly, right? No one likes the idea of riots or civil unrest. However, what comes of them, speaking specifically to the civil rights movement of the 60s, right? What comes of them starts the process of change. We're nowhere near where we need to be with that, but that agitation, that change, this is something that the government can do what the government's going to do. But when the people themselves decided it's a great idea or something that they want to embrace, you notice that change. You notice, and right or wrong, it's not a moral discussion really about, whether people should be able to do that or not. I think, again, like you're saying, our Constitution is mutable for a reason. It is designed to encompass society as it changes, not in spite of changes, right?
Sure.
So I think a lot of the flexibility is built into that. So when we look at something that's, who decides who's the watcher of watchers, right? Or who
watches the watchman?
Yeah, exactly. Which is a great movie, by the way. At least, I thought it was pretty good. So when you kind of look at this global landscape, and we're more connected than we've ever been, even when we're more disconnected than we've ever been, right? How, and I'm not even answering really your question to begin with, but you start to realize that a lot of these things, have to start to find their way through. There has to be that agitation for change. What's the catalyst for this? It may very well be that our current presidency is a catalyst for change in how America interacts with the world, right? There's been enough of that kind of negative activation, if you will, that will foment and cause change. We're already seeing that pendulum swinging, at
Sure.
least in the minds of those who are reacting to it. I mean, people are still digging their heels in, which is sad to see. But so you have a lot of this stuff. So when it comes to all this technology and all these wrappers and some of these decisions about the nature of being, I don't think it's something where you can go stick a, what is it in France where they have the definition of a meter or a kilogram. You can't just go stick that finite piece of metal that weighs exactly the international metric standard for a kilogram and stick it into, a vacuum sealed chamber and something they call it. You can't do that with humanity. You can't do that with volition. You can't do that with will. You can't do that with social constructs at all. You can't define it because the Hootsies and the Tutsu, whatever that name of the culture is, I may have to edit that one out because that was stupid. The Zulus, you can't, or the Bantus made it into the news this week because somebody culturally appropriated, or Native Americans or the First Nations or white folks, black folks, Asians, whatever it is. You can't just distill them down to a base something, a base unit of measure outside of.
So real quick, I'm going to jump in because that's exactly what Neuralink is trying to do.
How are they doing it? Tell me how, Ed.
So they're assuming a correspondence between activations inside of the brain representing everything that you just discussed, what it is that makes us who we are. Now, I'm not necessarily disagreeing, again, with another vector at which we can measure the human brain. I'm not disagreeing with the idea, and it's not new, right? Like the other thing about Neuralink is this isn't new tech. It's just repackaged, right? We've been able to put leads inside of brains for a long time in the world of neuroscience and measure interesting things. Again, I'm not discrediting the engineers or the work that they've done or the advances that they've made. It's certainly a great incremental advance for the technology. But that's what a lot of the conversation of people who were excited about this technology captured was this idea, again, of individuality and how can we find this invariant representation of what individuality is when that kind of flies in the face of the pure definition of the word or the phrase. And that's what I want to make sure that we pay attention to when we head down the path of, studying disease. Cool. Trying to understand what it is. You can see I'm having my own internal struggle on this. So like I said, again, the idea of the technology is great. At least the potential applications in the world of like disease or figuring out ways in which we can stop the quick breakdown of this weird squishy thing we call a body. The other side of that is to make sure that, we pay attention to the power transfers that happen, i.e., the people who create this type of technology then have, whether it be economic or, in this case, deterministic control over the individuals that may have the implant, right? And again, just the number one ability that we have as humans, I think, I don't know of an animal yet that we've been able to create a representation of them asking why. The number one capability we have as humans, I think, my own opinion, is our ability to ask why. And I just want to make sure that we kind of empower people to do that. Continue to ask why. Why Neuralink? Why are you interested in understanding certain core concepts of consciousness? Why are you okay, so I can think of one, so I use the word concept. There's this idea that there's this separation in the world of, the mind, that there is concept and there's percept, right? So a lot of the stuff in the world of machine learning is strictly in the realm of percept, right? So we've created machines that are able to, or we've created approaches that are implemented on top of machines that are able to percept the world around us. We haven't necessarily headed down the path we are starting to in the world of machine learning, but we haven't necessarily captured a salient representation of what a concept would be. And what a concept would be with something like Neuralink, I want to make sure that we don't capture or try to capture the concept of choice, right? Like, so if you were to figure out some sort of pattern of activations inside of the human brain that averages across, a set of individual humans, and we determine that to be the activation of choice. Hey, Ed decided to make a choice right here on this measurement system. Let's go figure out what that choice is. I don't think that's necessarily, something we should dabble with yet, until we progress our understanding of psychology, till we progress our understanding of sociology and anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is because, again, we're kind of walking around blindly in the dark, if you will, with respect to what is it that we're trying to measure inside of the brain, because we don't have a clean way to map these weird intuitive like representations of what we've defined to be human to discrete values that we can measure inside of the brain, right? And yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, but just thinking out loud, like I said, ultimately this flies in the face of self-determinism, I think, my opinion, and making sure that we understand what that means in the larger. And this is, again, why I want the humanities to progress, is because maybe I'm wrong, and maybe psychologists have working theories that tell me I'm wrong. But I haven't found them yet. So,
well, I think the beauty of a lot of this stuff is, you can pull us out into our representative parts. I think Elon made the joke that, or how a single atom of hydrogen suddenly became sentient after billions of years, and then ended up as a Tesla. Oh yeah, that's cute. Thanks, buddy. I appreciate that. But to be able to say, and distill us down to that base level element, that base level hydrocarbon, if you will, that makes us that makes up our physical nature, also does a disservice, I think, to the unknown of what is being, the ostensible why. And like you're saying, that rationalization, that reasoning, it's not a raccoon washing the sugar fluff in the water and you're going, what the fuck just happened? That's not a why. That's a cause and effect that's easily explained by something was there, then it wasn't, right? The idea of permanence, right? When a kid sees themselves in a mirror and recognizes that it's them for the first time, that's an idea of permanence, right? That's something that we have a higher order of, some animals do as well, not to limit it. So we see little glimpses of this, in my opinion. We see little glimpses of the whys and maybe some of the nature of being, through animals, right? Chimpanzees are very, very intellectually oriented, right? We see a lot of these type of things and we studied it. And to your point about humanities, there's so much more that has yet to be discovered about us. Psychology, sociology, anthropology can always be used as a whipping post, right? For people that you're not of, you and I had this discussion about the IQ test, right? And how wrong the nature of IQ tests. It's one thing to quantify, but it's another thing to use it as a tool of limitation or social restriction, right? You're not smart enough. Well, who the fuck said that? I may have more, it's always that's the duality of intelligence versus wisdom, all these things. And so we kind of get into this place. And so the humanities usually get a bad rap because they're soft. They operate in the margins of where you have to evaluate. You're right. You're going to set up using the scientific method. You're going to state your problem, form a hypothesis, test, and try to get there, right? So there is rigor. There is academic and scientific rigor to it. But you're dealing with something that's inevitably changeable, mutable completely, because no one human is like the other, right? Whereas science, we deal with the fixed realities of there's a periodic table. I'm going to operate within this construct. We've identified, or we've created the laws that have yet to be violated. And so we operate with kind of the fixed things. So hard sciences, if you will, physics and whatever, usually get, the more acumen, more credit for a lot of these things. But I think to your point, there's balance in both. There's the cool factor of, hey, I can do this. I measured that sodium ion channel and potassium ion channel. Sorry, I noticed that activation. I noticed that neuron triggering, and there's this synaptic reflex, and here we go. Right? I saw that. Pig snout touches the food and there's a triggering sound. God, and by the end of the night, that sound was so annoying, by the way. Gertrude, I appreciate you so much. You're a good pig, but seriously, lay off the food. But there's also, see, and then there's the ADD part. Maybe you can cure ADD and maybe get me back on track a lot quicker. But there's that side, but there's also the side of the choice. They'll use the pig's volition if they don't want to participate. We know very, very basic reinforcement rules, but we don't know why. Outside of innate need, we don't know why some of these things happen. So if you move that to a more complex, more reasoning that we know of, person or thing or object, which would be us. Yeah, dude, that's that dark art that's out there. That's something yet to be discovered. So I love the fact that they ask the questions. I think it's a blessing and it's a curse, right? It's somebody's identifying it, that there is this ideology, there is this capability, there is truly the ontology side of what's going on that could be answered by what goes on here, or could start to be answered. I think, no one's going to commit to it fully hand. But there's the other side that says, in the interim, I can do something. I believe I can do something that's maybe worthwhile to the here and now, to the physiology, to the neurology, that will help people in a way that they perhaps wouldn't be able to do before.
Agreed. And again, I'm not against certain uses of the technology. My ultimate goal here is, like, I sent you that tongue-in-cheek comment about life, liberty, and the pursuit of a neckbeard deciding what they want you to do. My reality is, like, I was trying to play a game of, like, just pay attention to the power transfer that happens, right? Because when you look at that line in our constitutions, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness being our ability to try to have this notion of self-determinism. And this notion of self-determinism is interesting when you start looking at measurements of the one thing that kind of by trial and error we've determined is what creates this consciousness that we have. What I think will be funny is if, we discover over the course of studies like this that the brain isn't the only thing that gives rise to all of our collective conscious. I don't know that to not be true or to be true. I just think it would be funny. Kind of the universe laughing at us. At one point in time, we thought that the ventricles inside of our brain are what housed our intelligence. These fluid sacs inside of our head. We're like, oh yeah, that right there, that's what holds our soul. But really, like, ultimately, I just want to make sure that we continue to ask that question, like, why are we doing this, and to what end? And again, I'm not against it. Clearly, I work in technology, and clearly I'm trying to recreate some aspects of what we deem to be intelligent with respect to humans or animals or whatever can operate in the perceptual realm. I, again, just want to make sure that we don't get overexcited and overinvest in something that accidentally, create this. I don't want to accidentally head down the path of our great filter, for anybody who knows what that analogy is.
I think that filter has been used. Great filter has been used by Elon several times. I got to pass the great filter.
Right. Are we there? Are we headed like headlong for it? Are we past it already? I don't know. And I just want to make sure that, again, how do we get around this, right? Education. That's the way we get around it. And then the last thing is, like, so you mentioned something interesting, like, again, in the vein of being able to understand, accelerating information transfer between humans, are there some sort of invariant representations of firing patterns that relate to a book? I don't know. Like, so if Ed looks at a book and has a Neuralink inside of his head and he's looking at a book, and then we average the effects of 1,000 humans or 1,000,000 humans who have these implants inside of their head, and we say, hey, look, there's some sort of, representation of firing patterns, that means book, that's, an expectation across humans the same. Maybe we can transfer that piece of information quicker between people without us having to create a collective vocal utterance. Cool. But, like, I just want to make sure that, again, we be careful with, these invariant representations of reality that we're trying to go after. So
I don't blame you, man. So this was a huge discussion about the three little pigs.
Ontology. We got into the three little pigs, man.
Yeah, we talked about Gertrude, so the one little pig, ontology, and the ostensible question of why.
Yep.
There we go. And I'm pretty sure we have some fodder for next time. We're going to chat through this stuff too.
That sounds good to me, man.